So we're doing entire debate lasted 56 seconds, starting in 3, 2, 1.
This atheist and this pastor were debating morality, and the ending literally feels scripted because it's such an epic mic drop. Check it out.
Mic drop. I work with murderers and pedophiles all the time.
I have a least favorite pedophile.
Are they wrong?
Are they wrong?
Yes.
They're wrong by your subjective standard.
They are technically intersubjectively wrong.
So they're not absolute.
Intersubjectively. No, because absolute would mean that it would be
So the
debate's over. Why?
They are intersubjectively wrong.
So you admit.
I would just say subjectively.
They are not absolutely wrong. The Green River Killer is not absolutely
But
wrong.
if it was absolute, then you wouldn't need to say it. You would need to enforce it. I don't think you know what the word absolute means.
You came to debate that your worldview provides a foundation for ethics.
Foundation for ethics, so you have to actively self-enforce.
The humanist perspective does provide a foundation for ethics because, again,
You have to actively uphold them.
Is wrong. Murder
Wrong by a
is
subjective human standard.
according to the cultural conversation that we are all of which a part.
So the second that the
cultural conversation changes,
does murder become moral?
Yes, because that's what's happened in the past. Suddenly they become moral because, again, they become protected by law, like slavery was protected by law. So all of a sudden, again, that society considered it moral to do that. Even, that would have had to have been the case. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. So that is all it takes is the collective conversation. So he's technically, objectively correct. I love this term of absolute. Like, define what you mean by absolute. Because to me, just maybe I'm a stickler for definitions, absolute would mean that it goes without saying that it's inherent, that it can't be questioned. So if it can't be questioned, how come so many people can question it? How come so many people can do those things despite that? We might collectively hold and say, okay, doing this thing is wrong, and we all agree, or the majority of people agree, but if it was absolute, you wouldn't need to do that. Again, an absolute would go without saying. It would be an inherent, where it's as absolute as the air that you have to breathe, right? You need oxygen to survive. You really aren't going to see debate on that, and nobody has to uphold it or enforce it. It's just, it goes without saying. So you can say that's an absolute. You need food to eat to survive, right? This is not an absolute because you can just easily disregard it. I can't disregard, I'm just going to stop breathing because I don't feel like it. I subjectively don't think I need to, right? But you could do that with the other side of, you could just disregard this supposedly absolute morality by saying, I'm going to ignore it and just do a crime anyway. So it's a really frustrating argument because people are acting like, look at him dunk on him, but it's always these unpleasant truths. Like, you're claiming something that is true that is uncomfortable to believe, so wow, you must be wrong. Imagine saying that. So it's called entire debate lasted 56 seconds. Let's listen to it. Or let me do the 3, 2, 1. Like, my false inherent morality isn't actually inherent. Wow, your argument is so wrong. Also, we need the law and constant social indoctrination to uphold this artificial morality that we subjectively construct. Like, what do you mean, dude? Because they're saying like, it's like society determines what is moral and immoral, and they're saying it as an absolute, like, so if society says slavery is okay and it's moral, then it becomes moral. But it does by their standard because they're doing it. Like, slavery did happen, so evidently it is just as subjective. You might not like it, you might not agree with it, and so the way that you conquer that isn't to say, morality is absolute. That's why all these immoral things by that absolute standard of morality still happen and have happened throughout all of human history because it's so absolute that it requires constant human effort to uphold it, which means it's not absolute. That means it is subjective. That means it requires constant reinforcement and practice through externality, enforcement, laws, social indoctrination, stigma, etc. So, in other words, you're admitting it's subjective in practice. So how would you have beaten slavery? You would have had to socially come up with that notion and collectively agree as a society that this is wrong and we shouldn't do it, which is kind of eventually what did happen, right? A lot of people were against it. They have a war, kind of partly about it at least. Like, so this notion, morality isn't inherent and it's up to what society says it is at a given time, but that is true because that's what they practice. So your belief in an absolute morality doesn't stop the reality of subjective morality happening, that terrible things happen all the time. And so, again, you're confusing the ideal with the reality. Just because your ideal is, yes, I would love a world where nobody ever hurts anybody or nobody ever kills anybody. That might be my moral and my subjective ideal. and many people may agree with that. However, if it was absolute, then it wouldn't be a concern. It's not absolute because it takes that constant upholding of it. So you have to win that argument and fight through social Darwinism, because if a society really does believe in something that is, they wouldn't do it if they didn't think it was right. So how did we get to the point where they thought slavery was right, or genocide was right, or things like this? Or how did they let it happen anyway? So I love this is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen, because you're not saying that you're treating it as an absolute, but realizing it's not one at the same time. So you just don't get it. Like, you'll say morality is absolute, but it requires constant human action to practice it and uphold it. But then you're also saying that, well, if it's subjective, that means anything can be subjectively moral. But it is from their point of view, right? So you're saying, how could it be subjectively moral to have slaves and to do all these terrible things? Well, it could be because people have done it, and they often don't believe that they're doing anything wrong when they're doing it. Otherwise, that's very hard to justify. If they realize they're doing something wrong, especially collectively as a society, they probably wouldn't do it so widely and so conspicuously. So you're acknowledging, like, oh, so all it would take for society to believe that slavery is moral is for them to just assert it or to practice it. Well, evidently that did happen. There was slavery in various societies throughout history. So yes, all it took was for people to collectively believe that. But that shows you how arbitrary and subjective morality is, and human standards are. That they do change at the drop of a hat, and that's how simple and how easily manipulated they can be. So you have to stay vigilant and hold it to a high standard, and don't take morality for granted and take power away from people, and realize that you have to actively uphold something if you do believe it. Let me try to get it with the timestamp, but it's not really working for me too well here. It's only 56 seconds long. But yeah, that's true. A real slam dunk. I'm glad I never have to worry about anything immoral by your subjective standard happening, because I guess it's just absolute. So the fact that you have to actively uphold it, like, what if the police all change their mind and they don't want to enforce the law anymore? Suddenly it's not moral anymore. I mean, again, you can hold your own standard, but it's not, again, absolute would imply, an absolute is the fact that you need oxygen to breathe, to survive, right? That's an absolute. It doesn't matter what your subjective opinion is, you still need it, unless you use some major technological workaround. But with morality, it's like, oh, it's wrong to kill somebody, but people still do it. So you can still say it's wrong. That's certainly your opinion. Most people would agree with you. I would agree with you. But it doesn't mean that it's absolute. It means it's preferential. We want to believe it. We want to agree with it. But yeah, it doesn't mean it's absolute. So this is one of those things that's insidious and tempting, that is easy. He's even saying, oh, it's a mic drop and this and that. It's easy to get lulled into these sorts of things that seem like, oh, look, it's a short form, quick edit, hot take. But if you actually think about it at all, to me, the word absolute means that it's unquestionable. To me, it means that it's inherent. So unless, again, I don't know what definition of absolute you could be using here, but if you say that it's absolute, what that means is now it doesn't require subjective human reinforcement. It doesn't require subjective human law enforcement or anything, right? It would be absolute. So in the context of God, you would say, well, he would strike you down with a bolt of lightning if you did something wrong, right? It's wrong, so therefore God will punish you. But instead, oh no, subjective human beings have to punish you with law enforcement, with court, with, again, even social stigma. You have to be indoctrinated from a young age. If you were born in the jungle, right, you wouldn't have these same views necessarily. So you can argue for an end result. And let me watch it again. This is really incredible that, okay, we're starting in, let me see. We're starting in 3, 2, 1.
This
atheist and this pastor were debating morality. Ending literally feels scripted because it's such an epic mic drop. Let's check it out. I work with murderers and pedophiles all the time.
Are they wrong?
He's very annoying. Yes, they are.
Or they're wrong by our subjective view.
Intersubjectively
wrong.
No.
Thank you. So the debate's over, friends.
If it was absolute, then you wouldn't need to say it. So he's acting like it's his position.
Mr. Anderson, that they are not absolutely wrong. The Green River Killer is not absolutely wrong. Ted Bundy is not absolutely wrong.
It's so absolute that you have to have this conversation about it and feel self-righteous about it.
Worldview provides a foundation for ethics.
A foundation for ethics that you have to actively self-enforce and uphold.
Provide a foundation for ethics, because again, rape is wrong, murder is wrong. According to the cultural
According to the laws, according to society.
The second that the cultural conversation changes, then rape and murder become moral?
See, that also shows like no faith in social Darwinism too. Like, oh, those things suddenly become moral because society says they are, but then wouldn't you assume that that wouldn't happen or that shouldn't happen? But even when you look back at history, certain things we would consider immoral today were considered okay back in the past, and even, moral, or at least morally acceptable, not, impermissible. So how can you say that's not true? So when you're saying that, it's like, okay, intersubjectively wrong, but let's just say subjectively, the point being that if it wasn't subjective, this conversation wouldn't even serve a purpose, right? So what do you mean by the word absolute? It's so absolute that I have to subjectively argue it with you, and you can disagree subjectively, and you can practice something else subjectively, like if you choose to just ignore it 5 seconds later. Like, here's an absolute. You have to breathe. You need oxygen. And even if you subjectively believe something different 5 seconds later, you still have to breathe, otherwise you'll die. Whereas with this, you could say, oh, it's wrong to kill somebody, and that's absolute. But then 5 seconds later, you believe something different, and you can practice something different just like that. So again, it's not being framed as, oh, you want to do that or you should do that. It's a question that if that's all it takes, then evidently it's not absolute, and that's why we put so much effort into, again, indoctrination and reinforcement and law enforcement, all these things that are subjective and require human input and interaction to be possible. Right, otherwise there would be no, then people could just do whatever they want, and it's a very strange thing. Let me watch it again. It's like saying what people want to hear versus because the word absolute doesn't mean a whole lot then. Because the worldview of ethics would require that you have, they are not absolute. Because you have to actively hold it up yourself, otherwise. Because, yeah, if suddenly the conversation changes and you change the law, then suddenly that would be right. So you would have, if it's no longer against the law and you've changed that, which you would think wouldn't happen, but that is how it works. It's as subjective as something being against the law. So, for example, gay marriage might have been against the law until now, and then the conversation changed to enable it, to make it legal, and so now suddenly something that was considered wrong before by society, enforced by its laws, is now considered okay. So that's all it took, is that subjective conversation and change to occur. And then let me look at the one from Jesse. But yeah, that's a perfect example of telling people what they want to hear versus what is actually true, like a inherent versus contrivance response argument. One person is arguing for the ideal. We want this to be absolute. We want to believe it, right? That is good to think of. But by saying it's absolute means that, okay, then I guess we don't need to do anything. It's pointless to even debate it, because if it's so absolute, then none of our subjective views or actions would have any impact. It would just be as absolute as the sun in the sky, or as our need to eat food, or as our need to breathe. So it would just go without saying. It wouldn't require subjective human input. But then also, it's a case where, it's absolute, but it's subject to all that, and then why would people still be able to do that? So, you're telling people, again, inherent versus contrivance response. You realize the inherent is, no, it's not absolute. It's subjective. People can just arbitrarily do whatever they want. Right? That's just a fact. It doesn't mean they should. But then you have to counteract that, which we actively do, again, with laws, with indoctrination, with, teaching our kids morality, with social stigma reinforcement. So through all those means, we actively uphold the illusion of this absolute. But if it was absolute, you wouldn't need to do those things. So it's not useful to pretend it's absolute. It's more useful to say, no, it is subjective, and so that's why we have to be vigilant and uphold it and try to kind of enforce and reinforce our views and try to uphold them in society, because if we don't, then people will just do whatever they want. So let me look at one thing here.